Welcome, you're here now. Wherever you are, perhaps already beneath a blanket with the lights low and the air still, let yourself begin to drift. There is no hurry, no urgency, nothing waiting for you but a quiet journey through time. Tonight we'll be slipping gently into the worn, weathered boots of a medieval peasant. We won't be rushing through history. Instead, we'll move slowly, one detail at a time, like a cartwheel turning through muddy village roads. You'll listen not to kings and conquests, but to the small everyday echoes of a life lived long ago, a life ruled by seasons, sunrises, and the steady rhythm of survival. There were no clocks, no schedules beyond the church bell, no conveniences, but there was rhythm. There was a steady pulse to life, measured in harvests, prayers, and the creak of old doors swinging in the wind. And there was cold. Winter in the medieval world was not a festive, cozy backdrop. It was a biting, breath-stealing presence. It settled into bones and beams. It whispered through thatched roofs and gathered in corners of stone cottages. You couldn't chase it away with a thermostat or a cup of tea. Instead, you learned to live beside it, to respect it, to prepare for it, in the slow, measured way that defined all of peasant life. But we won't begin with snow, not yet. First, we step into the year itself. Imagine the distant countryside. The year is perhaps 1320, maybe 1175. The precise date doesn't matter. What matters is the stillness, the hush of early morning in a village no larger than a handful of families, a scattering of timber-framed homes with low doorways and earthen floors. Nearby, fields stretch toward the horizon, narrow, irregular, and marked by shared labor rather than personal ownership. You wake just before dawn, not because you want to, but because you must. There is no clock, but the roosters crow, the shift in light, the habit passed down from parent to child. The rhythm of waking is embedded in your bones. Your home is dark and quiet. The fire has burned low overnight, as it always does. You kept it smoldering under ash. Wasting wood is unthinkable, but the room is still cold. The warmth you feel is mostly from the shared breath of your family, sleeping close together under wool and straw-stuffed bedding. It takes a moment to sit up. Your body aches, not from age necessarily, but from repetition. You've lifted the same buckets, carried the same sacks, bent over the same soil for years now. Even as a child, your world was filled with work. Outside, the light is still pale gray, the kind of light that never quite becomes day. Your boots are stiff, and so your day begins. We'll step deeper into this rhythm in just a moment. The tasks, the toil, the small joys and daily discomforts of the average peasant. But first, consider this. History is often told through the lens of power, of kings and queens, battles and banners. But these were the exceptions, not the norm. The world turned slowly and endlessly on the shoulders of those whose names were never written down, who lived, loved, toiled, and died without fanfare, their stories scattered like chaff in the wind. Tonight, we honor them with stillness, with detail, with time, because peasant life was not one thing. It was not always misery, nor always simplicity. It was a patchwork of endurance, of community, of quiet resilience. There were moments of warmth amid the chill. Familiar hands, the smell of fresh bread, a story told by firelight. But there were also long nights, harsh landlords, illnesses without names, and hunger that came not from dieting, but from the sky, when the rains came too early or the frost too late. Still, they endured, and that, perhaps more than anything, is what history forgets. Not the grand victories, but the quiet survival, the uncelebrated continuation of life. So tonight, as the wind rises outside your window or the silence of your room grows deeper, imagine yourself there. A winter morning, a one-room cottage, a life shaped by earth, wood, wool, and fire. You won't last a day in their boots, but for a little while you can walk with them, slowly, calmly, without judgment, without haste. Now let us begin. Let us rise with them just before dawn. Let us open the creaking door and step into the frost-bitten world of a medieval peasant. A bum. Imagine yourself waking up in a one-room timber-framed cottage. The roof above you is thatched with straw, thick but imperfect. The cold has crept in overnight. The fire is low, only faint embers beneath gray ash. Your breath clouds the air as you sit up, stiff from sleeping on a mattress stuffed with straw atop a wooden frame. The weight of a woolen blanket holds some of the chill at bay, but it's never truly warm in winter. You slept beside others, your spouse, children, perhaps an aging parent, all gathered for warmth in the same narrow bed or on pallets nearby. There are no windows as you'd recognize them, just small slits or shutters, sometimes covered with oiled parchment to block the worst of the wind. Outside, the sun hasn't risen, but the rooster is already crowing. The day has begun. You move carefully. Your feet find your boots, if you have any, and you shuffle toward the hearth. You rake away the ash and feed it a few dry sticks. Smoke curls slowly upward through the hole in the roof. The smell inside your cottage is layered. Smoked damp wool, cooked onions from last night, the faint musk of animals, because just on the other side of a half-wall partition, a few chickens or a pig sleep in the corner. It's not carelessness, it's necessity. The animals' warmth matters in winter. Your barn is just a lean-to. This room is your shelter, kitchen, sleeping space, and storeroom all in one. Your first job of the morning is not glamorous. It's often tending the fire, fetching water from the communal well, or checking the animals. In winter, the trough may be frozen. You break the surface with a stick or your bare hand. If it's summer, you're already swatting flies. If it's spring or autumn, mud clings to everything. Seasons are not poetic, they are practical. Next comes food. You'll eat what's left from the day before. Most mornings begin with coarse, dark bread, dense, made from barley or rye. Maybe a little cheese, aged hard and crumbling. If you're lucky, yesterday's stew is still in the pot, thick with root vegetables and scraps of salt pork or beans. Meat is rare except on feast days or when something is slaughtered. Eggs if the hens are laying. Herbs or leeks from the garden if the season allows. You don't eat alone. Meals are taken together, quietly, without rush. Every bite matters. Waste is unthinkable. Not everyone works the fields, though many do. In winter, tasks shift. Mending tools, spinning wool, weaving, chopping wood, collecting fuel, making candles, repairing fences. There is always something to do. The Lord's land comes first. Your small strip may give vegetables or flax, but most of your labor supports the estate. You owe rent in crops or labor. The bailiff or reeve, representatives of your lord, visit regularly. They tally your yields and inspect your stores. Work begins at sunup and ends at sundown. Winter means shorter days, but not easier ones. You work until your hands crack from cold or go stiff from wet. Gloves are rare. Tools are simple. Wooden plows, sickles, buckets. Each task is repetitive but skilled. A poorly dug furrow or bad thatch job can mean real hardship. When your body tires, there's no soft chair waiting. You squat, lean on a post, or sit on a stool by the fire. When your hands ache, you flex them and keep going. Evenings are dim. Candles are costly, so most light comes from the hearth. The smoke blackens the rafters. You may tell a story, you may sing, but more often you sit quietly, shelling beans or mending cloth. Perhaps the priest stops by, or a neighbor, trading eggs for wool. Gossip spreads slowly. News from outside your manor is rare and uncertain. Illness is common. It lingers in the lungs, the joints, the belly. You've known people who've died from fevers, from childbirth, from a bad cut. You accept death as a companion, you pray. You wrap another shawl around your shoulders and go on. Because you must. When you sleep again, it is not in silence. You hear the crackle of the fire, the soft breathing of those beside you, the shifting of animals, the wind through the thatch. You close your eyes, you rest. And if you are lucky, you'll do the same tomorrow. Now, let us drift gently into another thread of medieval life. While most peasants endured in silence, toiling from dawn to dusk, a few dared to raise their voices and their swords. One such figure emerged not from the nobility, but from among the laborers, the tanners, the common folk. Wat Tyler. Imagine England in the year 1381. The air is thick with unrest. A devastating plague, what we now call the Black Death, has swept through the land just decades earlier, thinning the population by half. Fields lie untilled. Entire villages are empty. But those who survive now see things differently. Labor, once cheap and abundant, is suddenly precious. The surviving peasants, now essential to the economy, begin to understand their value. The ruling elite, however, respond with fear. They tighten laws, they freeze wages, they reassert control, and eventually they demand more money in the form of a poll tax, levied on every adult regardless of income. For many, it's the final insult, and the result is one of the most remarkable uprisings in English history, the Peasants' Revolt. Very little is known about Wat Tyler's early life. Even his name, Wat, may have simply been a nickname for Walter. He was likely a tradesman, a roof tiler, or possibly a blacksmith. Not nobly born, not educated in the halls of a manor, but raised among working people. By all accounts, he was articulate, persuasive, and deeply committed to fairness. Tyler comes into focus as a leader only when the revolt is already underway. Sparked first in Essex and Kent, thousands of peasants, labourers and artisans begin marching toward London, destroying tax records and looting manor houses along the way. Their cause is not mindless chaos. They have demands: the end of serfdom, the reduction of taxes, the dismissal of corrupt officials, and they want the king, young Richard II, only 14 years old, to hear them. It is Wat Tyler who organises and channels this energy. He is chosen by the rebels as a spokesman. His leadership is calm, firm, and uncompromising. As they enter London, they do not simply riot. They issue demands. They meet with officials. They believe that justice can be achieved through negotiation. And for a moment, it seems they succeed. On June 14th, 1381, King Richard meets the rebels outside London. He agrees, at least in word, to their requests. Serfdom would be abolished. Pardon would be granted. The rebels rejoice. But Tyler is not convinced. He knows that promises made in haste can vanish just as quickly. The next day, Tyler returns to speak again, this time at Smithfield. He rides out to meet the king face to face, a bold gesture for a commoner. Eyewitnesses say he was poised and respectful, though firm in his demands. But something goes awry. Accounts differ. Some say Tyler spoke too freely, others that he insulted the king's company. Words were exchanged, tensions flared. Suddenly violence broke out. Sir William Walworth, the Lord Mayor of London, slashed at Tyler with a sword. Others joined in. Tyler fell from his horse, mortally wounded. The rebels, stunned and leaderless, hesitated. King Richard seized the moment. With remarkable calm, he told them, "You shall have no captain but me." It worked. The crowd dispersed, still believing the king meant to honor his word. But Richard did not. Within days, he revoked all the promises. The rebellion was crushed, many were executed, and serfdom, though weakened, endured for generations. And yet, Tyler's name lingered. He became a symbol, not of violent rebellion, but of courage. Of a common man who dared to speak plainly to a king. His life, though brief and sparsely recorded, altered the course of history. The elite had been shaken, the peasants had risen, and the world had shifted, however slightly, toward a different future. You can imagine Tyler's last moments, perhaps lying in a shadowed chamber, bleeding, confused, or perhaps defiant to the end, knowing that his cause would outlive him. We cannot know for certain. But his story, passed down quietly in old chronicles and whispered in taverns, reminds us that even the quietest voices, when raised together, can echo through time. Let your mind wander now across the English countryside. Rolling hills, hedgerows, clusters of sheep grazing under soft skies. Here and there, you might notice something peculiar. A dip in the ground, faint ridges forming rectangles, or rows of stones where no buildings now stand. These are the ghosts of villages, long vanished from maps and memory. Across Britain, there are more than 3,000 known sites of deserted medieval villages, or DMVs. Places that once bustled with life, now little more than gentle indentations beneath grassy fields. No towers, no ruins, just silence. And yet these quiet places are full of secrets. The reasons for their abandonment are many. Some fell to the Black Death. which struck in the mid-14th century with horrifying efficiency. Others declined due to climate change, specifically the Little Ice Age, which brought harsher winters, failed crops, and shortened growing seasons. Still others were lost to economic shifts, especially the transition from crop farming to sheep pasture. Sheep required fewer hands. A landowner might find wool more profitable than tenants. One of the most studied deserted villages is Warham Percy, located in North Yorkshire. Archaeologists have combed its fields since the 1950s. What they found was not a battlefield or a palace, but something arguably more valuable, the remnants of ordinary life. The outlines of about 40 houses, a village green, a manor house, a church whose stone still stands, weathered but watchful. Excavations at Warham Percy revealed clay walls once packed with wattle and daub, hearths stained with centuries of soot, bits of pottery, animal bones and simple tools. These were not the possessions of the powerful. They were the scraps of commoners, people who lived, cooked, argued, laughed, and worked on this now silent hill. There in shallow graves were dozens of disturbed skeletons, bones bearing cuts and marks made after death. For years, this was considered evidence of violence or perhaps religious ritual. Later analysis, however, suggested a different story: fear. These remains may have been desecrated to prevent them from rising again. In other words, the villagers feared the dead. Arms severed, skulls removed, bodies reburied with care, but also with apprehension. This wasn't unique to Warham Percy. Across Europe, medieval burial practices sometimes included strange precautions: stakes through chests, stones in mouths, heavy weights atop graves. A deep-seated anxiety lingered about what might happen if the dead were not properly contained. It's not difficult to imagine why. Disease swept through without warning. Death came suddenly. A neighbor who coughed on Monday might be buried by Thursday. The line between life and death felt tenuous. And yet, there is no indication that these people were unkind or cruel. They prayed. They planted herbs in neat garden rows. They buried their infants tenderly, sometimes with tiny tokens or beads. They left footprints in earthen floors, now long vanished. What remains are faint outlines, like shadows beneath the grass, telling us that here once a village lived and breathed. Today, the ruins of places like Warham Percy are protected, studied with care. Scholars use satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar, and even pollen analysis to understand what was grown, how people lived, and why they eventually left. But no record is perfect. Some villages vanished with no written trace. Their names were never recorded, their residents never known. Their stories left to the soil remain a mystery, and so we listen to the land, to the curves in the fields where sheep now graze, to the stones that once lined cottage walls, to the hush of wind passing through yew and oak, as if whispering tales we've nearly forgotten. The past is never truly silent. If you walk these lost villages with enough patience and enough wonder, you may begin to hear it. Picture a heavy wooden door set into stone. Outside, frost clings to the edges of the world, the sky a slate gray. But inside, warmth flickers across the walls. This is a medieval manor house, home to a noble family, and your shelter for the night. Unlike the cold that wraps the cottages of the peasantry, the manor glows with firelight. Large hearths roar at either end of the great hall, their flames feeding on seasoned logs. The air carries the scent of burning oak, woolen cloth, and roasted meat. Servants move softly across the floor, refilling goblets, straightening tapestries, and feeding the fires. This is not a castle. There are no towering battlements or deep moats here. A manor is more domestic, a home and an administrative hub. The lord and lady preside over the land, and their responsibilities are many. They hold court, manage tenants, settle disputes, and ensure their estate turns a profit. But when winter falls, and the harvest is long behind them, the rhythm slows. Tonight there is company, perhaps a neighboring baron and his wife, visiting with retinue in tow. They've brought news, gossip, and a gift, a bottle of spiced wine. The lady of the manor accepts it with a small bow, her wimple rustling as she moves. Dinner is served near sunset by candlelight. Long trestle tables are laid with trenchers, thick slices of stale bread used as plates and covered with meat pies, boiled vegetables, and the occasional delicacy. Sweetmeats, soft cheese, preserved fruits. Forks are rare. Most people eat with knives and fingers, wiping their hands on cloths or the bread itself. The mood is calm, not merry. Laughter is soft and proper. Music may drift in from a side chamber, a harp perhaps, or a small group of minstrels hired for the season. A storyteller might be called forth, reciting old tales of Arthurian knights or saints' miracles, their words rising and falling like the embers in the hearth. Upstairs, the Lord's private chamber is simple but comfortable. A large canopy bed, its curtains closed tight to hold in warmth. Woolen blankets layered with fur. A servant brings in a heated stone to tuck beneath the bedding. In the corner, a small devotional altar with a carved wooden cross and a beeswax candle flickering before it. Prayer, as always, ends the day. Children sleep in adjoining rooms or with the household tutor, curled under thick quilts. Servants sleep in the attic over the great hall, where the heat from the fires rises to meet them. The house itself breathes in silence. But life in the manor is not without hardship. Food stores must be carefully rationed. If the winter is long or the harvest was poor, even the nobility may go without luxury. Illness knows no class and spreads easily among household staff. And while the rooms are warmer than those of a peasant's hut, they are still drafty, damp and dim. Still, compared to the bare earth floors and icy thatch of the common cottages, this is comfort. Privacy, protection, and the illusion, if not always the reality, of control. As snow falls softly outside, the manor sleeps. The fire crackles down to coals. A final log splits with a hiss, and all is still. You are safe for the night. Mapadl. That concludes the 4-segment structure of this script. Its walls thick and weather-worn, perched atop a low hill overlooking the valley below. The wind moves like a whisper through its narrow corridors. It is just before dawn, and the only light comes from a few flickering tallow lamps along the inner walkway. A bell is about to ring. This is a place of silence, of order, of rhythm. Monks here live by the rule of St. Benedict, a code that shapes their days, their thoughts, their sleep, and their meals. In winter, the rules soften slightly, but the cold seeps in regardless. Into joints, into breath, into the very stones of the chapel. You rise in darkness for matins, the first of 8 daily prayers. Your wool robe is scratchy but warm, and you wrap your hands in your sleeves as you shuffle to the chapel. The air is heavy with incense. The cold stone beneath your knees is familiar now. The chants begin, a soft, droning call that echoes in Latin through the ancient space. Monastic life in winter is stripped to its bare essentials. Meals are fewer, meat is rare, the gardens lie dormant beneath frost, but the days remain full. Copying manuscripts, preparing herbal remedies, tending the sick, stoking the fires, and sweeping snow from cloister paths. The monastery is a world unto itself, self-sufficient, inward, quietly humming with purpose. Outside, villages struggle against hunger and illness. Inside, there is structure but not comfort. Yet for many, this was a life chosen, to serve, to study, to retreat from the world's noise and live in the steady rhythm of prayer and quiet work. When night comes again, you lie on a straw-filled mattress in your cold cell. The wind brushes the shutters. Your breath clouds the air, and still the bells will ring again before dawn. Let the snow settle around you now. Let the outside world grow quiet, as it so often did in the deepest winters of the medieval past. And imagine yourself sitting inside a modest, timber-framed cottage, low-roofed, with thick walls of wattle and daub. Smoke curls upward from the central hearth, escaping slowly through a hole in the thatch. The fire glows, orange and alive, and you are surrounded by shadows. In this world, there is no electricity, no central heating, and no understanding of weather patterns beyond what the sky reveals each morning. To the medieval mind, the winter months were a time of uncertainty. They were also a time of magic. With the long nights came stories and fears. In the countryside especially, where literacy was rare and oral tradition reigned, Winter was a canvas for the imagination. Across Europe, folklore served as a kind of second language, a way of explaining what could not be seen or understood, why a child might fall sick, why the wind howled strangely some nights, why a candle flickered when no draught could be felt. In England, it was said that the wild hunt roamed the skies on winter nights, a ghostly procession of hounds and riders led by a spectral king. To see it was an omen of death. In Germanic lands, the goddess Perchta was believed to visit homes during the 12 days of Christmas, rewarding the diligent and punishing the lazy, sometimes said to slit open the bellies of children who had misbehaved. And in Slavic regions, there were stories of Morozko, the winter demon or frost spirit, who punished disrespect and rewarded kindness in the cold. Superstitions were deeply woven into the rhythm of life. If a chicken refused to roost, it might mean a death was coming. A cracked loaf of bread could signal illness in the house, and people believed the evil eye, a glance filled with envy or ill will, could bring ruin to a home, especially during the vulnerable season of winter. To protect against these unseen forces, people kept charms above their doors, often made of iron, believed to ward off spirits. Rowan branches, salt, and ritual prayers were also common. In some homes, the ashes from the Yule log were spread across the floor or buried in the field to bring luck and shield the family from harm. Not all of this was fearful. Much of it was comforting, rituals that provided a sense of order and safety. The burning of the Yule log, for instance, was more than a festive act. It symbolized the return of light, the rebirth of the sun, and the gradual triumph over the long dark. In some areas, a piece of last year's Yule log was kept all year to kindle the next, linking past and present, warmth and memory. And light itself had meaning. Candlemas, celebrated in early February, was a holy day that marked the presentation of Christ at the temple. But it was also a moment when people brought candles to church for blessing. Those candles were then kept at home to be lit during storms or sickness, to protect against lightning and plague. Children were told stories, some playful, some frightening, that goblins came down the chimney, that spirits rode on the backs of owls, that to whistle indoors in winter was to summon misfortune. Whether believed literally or not, these tales kept young minds attentive and gave older generations a way to pass on both wisdom and warnings. In the monasteries and churches, superstition was officially discouraged. But even there, in candlelit chapels and drafty cloisters, monks sometimes recorded stories of visions and portents. Strange lights in the sky, phantom bells, unexplainable healings or afflictions. The line between sacred and folkloric was never clearly drawn. And in the end, these winter superstitions were rarely about terror. More often, they were about finding meaning in the coldest and quietest months of the year. They were stories told to fill the silence, to make sense of misfortune, and to remind people that they were not alone, even when the world outside was buried in snow. So the fire crackled, the tales were told, and as the wind howled through the forest beyond, those gathered around the hearth listened, watched the flames, and felt, however faintly, protected. Let us descend now, not into a castle or chapel, but into the cold, earthy silence of a root cellar. The door is low and wooden, weathered by frost. Beneath it, stone steps lead into the ground. You duck inside, lantern in hand, the dim flame casting wide shadows on the earthen walls. It's chilly here, damp and still. The air smells of soil, straw, and stored vegetables. Humble treasures from a garden now long asleep under a blanket of snow. This was a common space in rural medieval homes. The storage cellar carved into a hillside or tucked beneath a cottage. It was a lifeline. When the fields froze and the trees stood bare, survival meant planning months ahead and hoping that the harvest had been enough. Inside, you'll find turnips, parsnips, onions, and cabbages, their outer leaves tough and leathery, but still edible. There are clay pots sealed with wax, holding salted meats, pickled eggs, or fermented vegetables. If the family was fortunate, There might be a bag of dried beans or a small sack of grain, carefully rationed. Most food was brown, bland, and repetitive, but it was filling. Bread made from rye or barley was dense and sometimes flavored with dried herbs or old lard. Porridge thickened with root vegetables was eaten daily. A rare treat might be a bit of aged cheese or an apple dried months ago and kept for midwinter feasts. Fresh food was nearly impossible to come by. The idea of a fresh green salad in January would have seemed absurd. Everything was preserved, salted, dried, or pickled, without refrigeration. These methods were the only barrier between a family and hunger. Protein was rare, meat was precious, and often reserved for holidays if eaten at all. In many regions, especially during Lent or Advent, meat was forbidden for spiritual reasons. People ate fish if available, especially stockfish, a dried cod that could be rehydrated over hours. Its smell was strong and lingering, but it filled the stomach. Some households kept chickens, offering the occasional egg, though laying often stopped in the coldest months. A pig, if slaughtered in autumn, could feed a family all winter. Its fat rendered into lard, its meat hung to cure in the smoky rafters of the hearthroom. Sweetness was scarce, honey was a luxury. Sugar was nearly unheard of outside the wealthiest manors. For sweetness, one might steep herbs in hot water or chew dried berries, if they had survived the mice. And always there was the fear. Would the food last? Would the barrels stay sealed? Would rats or mold take what little remained? Every bite had weight. Every bowl of stew was both nourishment and measurement. How many days left until the first thaw? Winter meals were slow, simple, and heavy. They weren't meant for enjoyment. They were meant to sustain. So imagine the slow preparation of a winter soup, chopped onion, dried lentils, maybe a slice of last autumn's salted pork. The pot simmers for hours on the edge of the hearth. The smell fills the home. A child stirs it with a wooden spoon. A mother quietly counts how many portions are left. This is not just dinner. It's planning, it's hope, it's the calculation of survival. And above ground, snow still falls. The fields remain frozen. But inside, beneath the thatch, beneath the earth, in a small stone cellar and over a humble flame, the work of endurance continues. And in elevation, to a stone manor perched atop a wooded hill. The great hall is large and drafty. Its walls are built of grey stone, and its narrow windows are glazed with horn or oiled linen. Though the elite lived lives of greater comfort, winter remained a persistent and inconvenient companion. Imagine yourself in this grand, echoing space. A fire roars at one end of the hall. Its warmth does not fully reach the far corners. Tapestries hang on the walls, not for decoration, but insulation. Thick rushes or straw cover the floor, mingled with herbs like lavender, meadowsweet and rosemary to mask the smell of damp. Here life was different than in the village, but not necessarily easy. The noble household might have access to more food, more wood and better clothing, but they too depended on seasonal storage, good planning and labor from below. Without their servants, they were just as vulnerable to the cold. Daily life revolved around the hearth. The great hall served as both communal space and ceremonial center. Winter evenings were long, and so the household passed the time with storytelling, board games, religious reading, and music played on lutes or harpsichords. Courtiers might practice poetry or recite verses aloud as the wind howled outside. There were still chores. Noblewomen oversaw spinning, weaving, and sewing of garments, particularly woolen tunics, fur-lined cloaks, and linen underlayers. Men managed estates and received reports on livestock, harvests, and food stores. Pages and squires practiced skills by candlelight. Even the nobility lived by firelight and routine. Meals were more elaborate, but no less reliant on preservation. The manor kitchens produced pies of pigeon or venison served cold, eels preserved in jelly, dried fruits imported from afar, or mulled wine spiced with cloves and cinnamon offered variety. But they remained exceptions. Bread, broth, and ale were still the staples. And feasting, yes, feasting was a great centerpiece of winter among the elite. The 12 days of Christmas, from December 25th to Epiphany, were especially significant. These were days of respite and performance, of excess and hospitality. Whole boars might be roasted, minstrels were hired, a goose was carved with ceremony. But even here, luxury had limits. Castles were notoriously cold. Most rooms had no fireplace. Clothing was worn in layers, and fur was not fashion, it was insulation. Gloves, hats, and thick stockings were worn indoors. Even bedchambers required warming. Servants might place heated stones or iron pans filled with coals beneath the bedding before sleep. Sleep itself came early, often just after the last meal. Nightfall in winter was long and quiet. A noble family might sleep in canopied beds, draped in heavy curtains to trap body heat. Hot bricks wrapped in cloth were placed near the feet. Some nobles even shared beds, not just for company, but warmth. Beneath the elegance, there was still discomfort. Water froze in basins, ink turned sluggish, boots stiffened overnight. And when illness came, and it often did, the noble class had remedies, but no true cures. They too feared the long silence of January, the slow recovery from cold-born fevers. Even faith took on new weight. Churches attached to noble manors held longer vigils in winter, more prayers, more offerings to ensure health and safe passage through the dark months. Pilgrims and beggars arrived at their doors more frequently, hoping for alms or shelter. So while the noble life might seem glamorous by comparison, it was still bound by the same rhythms: fire and frost, food and famine, darkness and waiting. Comfort came in layers, in careful tradition, in warm bread and soft tapestries. But winter, ever impartial, visited them all. Imagine yourself in the nave of a small stone church, its windows narrow and misted with frost. Your breath fogs in the still air. Somewhere near the altar, a single candle glows, its flame flickering against the dark. You are wrapped in a wool cloak. Your fingers are cold, but you are not alone. Around you, the village gathers in quiet reverence, their shoes damp, their prayers murmured. In the medieval world, faith was not separate from the cold. It explained it. Winter was more than weather. It was a season of testing, of waiting, of penitence. People looked to the calendar of saints, the movements of the moon, and the teachings of the church to interpret the slow churn of ice and wind. The most powerful winter holidays were not celebratory, but symbolic. There was Candlemas, held on February 2nd, a midpoint between the darkness of winter and the promise of spring. In villages and monasteries, it marked the blessing of candles. These candles were then taken home and used throughout the year to ward off sickness and storm. Candlemas was not merely a ceremony, it was a spiritual shield. Imagine a procession winding through snow-covered paths, each person holding a flickering taper. The air smells faintly of beeswax and incense. They chant softly, a song of endurance, of light returning. Outside, the frost clings to bare branches. Inside, a priest offers Latin prayers. The warmth is not physical but spiritual. Other saints held symbolic ties to the season. Saint Blaise, honored on February 3rd, was invoked against throat ailments, a practical concern during long, cold winters. St. Nicholas, remembered in early December, was not a jolly figure but a solemn protector of the vulnerable. He was invoked during famines and icy hardships. The feast of St. Bridget on February 1st marked the beginning of the old Celtic spring. Her feast was tied to ancient pagan customs, folded into Christian tradition. People wove Bridget's crosses made of rushes and hung them in homes to guard against cold, hunger, and fire. Each of these observances brought people together. In a time when the nights were long and food uncertain, ritual provided rhythm. It structured weeks. It offered solace. It gave meaning to hardship. Fasting was also common during winter months, especially during Advent. The faithful refrained from meat, dairy, and indulgences, not as punishment but as preparation. Fasting was believed to cleanse the soul and align one's spirit with the struggles of Christ and the saints. And there was prayer, not the frantic kind, but slow, repeated, and meditative. In monasteries, the divine office was kept even through the dark nights, matins, lauds, prime, and more. These hourly prayers broke up the monotony and reinforced the idea that time itself belonged to God. Families recited psalms by the hearth. Children learned the stories of St. Anthony and St. Sebastian, figures who had faced great trials in deserts and plagues, now patrons of survival and healing. And all the while, behind every prayer was a quiet hope. Let spring come soon. Let the frost recede. Let the lambs be born safely. Let us see another Easter. So as you imagine yourself seated in that stone church, hands folded, a woolen hood pulled low, know that you are part of a seasonal rhythm far older than your own memories. Winter was more than hardship. It was spiritual terrain, a time for quiet, reflection, and trust. It asked for endurance not just of the body but of the heart. Now let us draw closer to the heart of things, not the hearth or the hall, but the quiet bonds between people. Because in winter, companionship was not merely a comfort, it was a necessity. Imagine yourself lying beneath a wool blanket, your breath curling upward into the frigid air of a small timber-framed room. Outside, the snow continues to fall. Inside, you are not alone. In this time and place, warmth comes not from a fireplace, but from the shared presence of another body, a spouse, a child, even a sibling. Beds were often shared out of necessity, not romance. But let us begin with marriage itself, which in the medieval world was often a transaction, a duty, and sometimes a refuge. Winter, with its long nights and limited movement, was often a season of weddings, particularly in January and February. The harvest was over, the fields were dormant, families had time to gather, and bread was, for now, still plentiful. Imagine a simple ceremony held inside a small parish church. The bride wearing her best woolen kirtle, perhaps dyed with madder root to a dusky red. The groom in stiff boots, his hands newly washed, still cold. There might be no ring, but there would be witnesses, blessings, and a quiet meal afterward. Not a feast, but warm broth, dark bread, and perhaps dried fruit if fortune allowed. Marriage was seen as the natural order. The church instructed couples in duty to labor together, bear children, and uphold the faith. Love in the romantic sense was not expected, but companionship over time could blossom in quiet ways. And in the depths of winter, that companionship became more than symbolic. The long nights required cooperation. One to tend the fire, one to watch the children, one to rise before dawn and fetch water, one to mend the torn cloak by firelight. A life lived side by side. For the poor, space was tight and privacy almost non-existent. Yet these small homes held deep emotional lives. Moments of tenderness, quiet conversation, shared labor, and whispered prayers. Children were born in these same beds, often during winter. And sometimes people passed from this life during winter too, surrounded by the same hands that had kept them warm for years. Not all relationships were formal. Widows and widowers often remarried, not out of romance, but survival. A man alone in winter might not last long without help. A woman without household support faced similar risk. Companionship was practical, mutual. In towns, where space was narrower and life more crowded, neighbors became winter allies. A borrowed candle, a shared pot of stew, a watchful eye over children when illness came. Marriage was one kind of bond, but community was another, a net beneath the ice. And not all slept warm. Servants, the landless, the orphaned, many faced cold alone. Inns were rare and expensive. Charitable houses sometimes opened their doors. Monasteries might offer thin soup and prayer. But for many, winter was endured in solitude, broken only by brief warmth. A kind word, a fire glimpsed through a shutter. Still, the idea of togetherness carried its own weight. Ballads told of lovers separated by frost. Poems prayed for the return of spring, so marriages could be blessed in sun and not sleet. And folk rituals, even those the church disapproved of, often centered around love, fertility, and reunion. So as you imagine yourself lying in that small wooden room, warmed by shared breath and woven blankets, know that this too was a form of survival. To be known, to be held, to wake in the dark and hear another's quiet breathing. In a season defined by absence of warmth, of food, of light, the presence of another person was everything. Picture a world blanketed in snow. The fields lie dormant beneath a quiet frost, and the branches of the trees stretch bare toward a pale sky. You might imagine silence, rest, stillness, a kind of natural pause. But in a medieval village, there was no such thing as a winter break. Though the land no longer called out for harvest or planting, the people still moved through each day with purpose. Work, though altered, did not stop. It simply turned inward, into homes, into barns, into smaller, humbler rhythms. The kind of labor that didn't make history books, but kept entire communities alive. Imagine yourself waking just before dawn in a thatched cottage. The floor beneath your feet is icy stone. Your breath is visible in the air. The fire has burned low during the night, and your first task is to coax it back to life. You feed it kindling and blow gently. Sparks glow in the ash. The warmth is slow to return, but you can't afford to wait. Because winter, for all its beauty, demands work. You pull on a woolen tunic patched from years of wear. Your shoes are stiff and worn. Outside, the snow crunches underfoot. If your family is fortunate enough to have livestock, a cow, a few goats, perhaps a pig, they rely on you more than ever during these cold months. Water troughs have frozen overnight. You break the ice with a stick or stone. They must be carried in, dry and scratchy in your arms. The barn is dark and close, filled with the smell of straw and the gentle sounds of shifting animals. You check each one, ears for frostbite, hooves for rot, bellies for signs of illness. Back inside, the rest of the household is stirring. Children begin their small duties, sweeping the dirt floor, fetching kindling, helping to stir the morning porridge. Winter is often remembered for its harshness, but it was also a time when families were closest, bound together by necessity and proximity. For the women of the house, the cold season brought no rest. If anything, their tasks multiplied. Spinning wool, a year-round duty, became a daily occupation. Long hours by the fire were spent turning fleece into thread, thread into fabric. Looms were set up in corners. The creak of wood, the soft hiss of the fire, the hum of breath, it was a quiet music of its own. There were also repairs to be made, socks to darn, tunics to mend, cloaks to patch. Every scrap of cloth was saved, every piece of clothing expected to last through several winters. To have enough clothing for each member of the family was a small triumph. In the pantry, the storage of food required vigilance. Root vegetables stored in cellars needed turning to prevent spoilage. Dried beans and lentils were checked for pests. Salted meats were hung with care, and supplies were carefully rationed, especially once February arrived, a month often feared for its hunger. Winter was also a time of quiet craft and preparation. Men repaired tools dulled by months of labor. Handles were reshaped, blades sharpened, rope braided. Children carved toys, whittled spoons, twisted twine. Even in stillness there was movement, a rhythm not of urgency but of persistence. And let us not forget the spiritual labor of the season. Winter, with its long nights and bleak days, brought reflection. Monasteries held longer services. Villagers gathered around fires to hear readings or repeat familiar prayers. Stories were told, old ones, passed down from grandmother to child. Myths of wolves and winter saints, of miracles in the snow. Sometimes, during the rare sunlit hours, people would walk out to the edge of the woods to gather pine branches or inspect the traps laid weeks before. Winter hunting was difficult and dangerous, but it could bring much-needed fat and meat to the table. And even when the hunt failed, the time outside could offer a strange, icy peace. Not all labor was physical. The mental toll of the season weighed heavily. Days without sunlight blurred together. Illness could linger for weeks. Worry became a companion. Would the food last? Would the animals survive? Would the children stay warm enough? So while the world outside might seem hushed, a medieval winter was not restful. It was a season of deliberate movement, slow, continuous, and quietly heroic. Every log split, every cloak patched, every bowl of stew stirred was a gesture of survival. Stillness, in truth, was rare, because stillness meant cold. Stillness meant hunger. Stillness meant danger, and so they worked, not in haste, but with care. Not with restlessness, but with resolve. A kind of ancient rhythm, measured and mundane, that carried them through the frost, day after quiet day. Picture a world blanketed in snow. The fields lie dormant beneath a quiet frost, and the branches of the trees stretch bare toward a pale sky. You might imagine silence, rest, stillness, a kind of natural pause. But in a medieval village, there was no such thing as a winter break. Though the land no longer called out for harvest or planting, the people still moved through each day with purpose. Work, though altered, did not stop. It simply turned inward, into homes, into barns, into smaller, humbler rhythms. The kind of labor that didn't make history books, but kept entire communities alive. Imagine yourself waking just before dawn in a thatched cottage. The floor beneath your feet is icy stone. Your breath is visible in the air. The fire has burned low during the night, and your first task is to coax it back to life. You feed it kindling and blow gently. Sparks glow in the ash. The warmth is slow to return, but you can't afford to wait, because winter, for all its beauty, demands work. You pull on a woolen tunic patched from years of wear. Your shoes are stiff and worn. Outside, the snow crunches underfoot. Your first duty, the animals. If your family is fortunate enough to have livestock, a cow, a few goats, perhaps a pig, they rely on you more than ever during these cold months. Water troughs have frozen overnight. You break the ice with a stick or stone. Hay must be carried, in dry and scratchy in your arms. The barn is dark and close, filled with the smell of straw and the gentle sounds of shifting animals. You check each one, ears for frostbite, hooves for rot, bellies for signs of illness. Back inside, the rest of the household is stirring. Children begin their small duties, sweeping the dirt floor, fetching kindling, helping to stir the morning. And porridge. Winter is often remembered for its harshness, but it was also a time when families were closest, bound together by necessity and proximity. For the women of the house, the cold season brought no rest. If anything, their tasks multiplied. Spinning wool, a year-round duty, became a daily occupation. Long hours by the fire were spent turning fleece into thread, thread into fabric. Looms were set up in corners. The creak of wood, the soft hiss of the fire, the hum of breath. It was a quiet music of its own. There were also repairs to be made, socks to darn, tunics to mend, cloaks to patch. Every scrap of cloth was saved, every piece of clothing expected to last through several winters. To have enough clothing for each member of the family was a small triumph. In the pantry, the storage of food required vigilance. Root vegetables, stored in cellars, needed turning to prevent spoilage. Dried beans and lentils were checked for pests. Salted meats were hung with care, and supplies were carefully rationed, especially once February arrived, a month often feared for its hunger. Winter was also a time of quiet craft and preparation. Men repaired tools dulled by months of labor. Handles were reshaped, blades sharpened, rope braided. Children carved toys, whittled spoons, twisted twine. Even in stillness, there was movement. A rhythm not of urgency, but of persistence. And let us not forget the spiritual labor of the season. Winter, with its long nights and bleak days, brought reflection. Monasteries held longer services. Villagers gathered around fires to hear readings or repeat familiar prayers. Stories were told, old ones passed down from grandmother to child. Myths of wolves and winter saints, of miracles in the snow. Sometimes, during the rare sunlit hours, people would walk out to the edge of the woods to gather pine branches or inspect the traps laid weeks before. Winter hunting was difficult and dangerous, but it could bring much-needed fat and meat to the table, and even when the hunt failed, the time outside could offer a strange, icy peace. Not all labor was physical. The mental toll of the season weighed heavily. Days without sunlight blurred together. Illness could linger for weeks. Worry became a companion. Would the food last? Would the animals survive? Would the children stay warm enough? So while the world outside might seem hushed, a medieval winter was not restful. It was a season of deliberate movement, slow, continuous, and quietly heroic. Every log split, every cloak patched, every bowl of stew stirred was a gesture of survival. Stillness, in truth, was rare, because stillness meant cold, stillness meant hunger, stillness meant danger. And so they worked. Not in haste, but with care. Not with restlessness, but with resolve. A kind of ancient rhythm, measured and mundane, that carried them through the frost day after quiet day. And so, as our journey through the cold corridors of medieval life comes to a close, we return, quietly, to the present. You've wandered across snow-laden fields, wrapped in woolen cloaks. You've knelt by fires that barely warmed your fingers. You've stood inside thatch-roofed cottages and grand stone keeps alike, listening to wind moan through shutters and hooves crunch through frozen mud. You've seen both the hardship and the endurance, the ordinary and the extraordinary, of those who faced long winters in an age before insulation, electricity, or even the simple comfort of modern boots. You've shared a bowl of barley porridge with a peasant and walked beneath the high arches of a cathedral lit only by candlelight. You've learned what it took to survive. Not just the cold, but the long, dark nights of hunger, stillness, and silence. There's something comforting in knowing that despite it all, they did survive. Generation after generation, wrapped in layers, bound by ritual and routine, surrounded by family and livestock alike, medieval people met each winter with a blend of pragmatism, resilience, and quiet hope. They chopped wood in the waning light, dried herbs when the sun still shone, and salted meats not out of luxury, but necessity. And now, centuries later, their rhythms echo faintly through time, in our own winter routines, in the way we welcome warmth, in the way we wait for spring. Perhaps tonight, under your own blankets, you can feel that faint echo too, a link, however quiet, to the past. A shared human instinct to endure, to adapt, to prepare, to dream of warmth while the wind rattles the eaves. Sleep now, if you haven't already. Let the sounds of that long-ago world drift softly into the hush of your room. The clang of distant bells, the hush of snow, the soft rustle of straw. The past is still with us, but gently now, like embers glowing low in the hearth. Rest well, and thank you for joining us for another quiet journey into the forgotten world of boring history. For sleep good night. As winter tightened its grip on the medieval countryside, the rhythm of life shifted once again, this time around the hearth and the table. Food, always a central concern, became even more precious in the cold months. The harvest was long over. The fields lay dormant beneath frost. What remained was whatever had been preserved, stored, or carefully rationed. And so we ask, what did people eat when the land gave nothing fresh? Imagine yourself seated in a low-ceilinged cottage. The walls are thick with smoke. The fire glows dimly in the hearth. Above, bundles of dried herbs hang from wooden rafters. Sage, thyme, perhaps rosemary if you were lucky. Nearby, a smoked ham dangles in the rafters, slowly aging. On the table sits a bowl of thick porridge, steaming slightly, made from oats and barley. It's bland, but warm, hearty, filling. This is winter food in its most honest form. Simple, practical, and designed to last. The peasant diet in winter was shaped by preservation methods and availability. Without refrigeration or greenhouses, people turned to salting, drying, smoking, fermenting, pickling, and cellaring. Grains, the cornerstone of most meals, were stored in sacks or barrels. Barley, rye, and oats were most common among the poor. While the wealthy enjoyed more access to wheat, these grains were ground into flour, boiled into porridge or baked into flat, dark loaves of bread, dense and coarse, often mixed with beans or bits of chaff to stretch the supply. Root vegetables featured heavily. Carrots, turnips, onions, leeks and parsnips. These were buried in straw-lined pits or stored in cool, dark cellars. When stewed slowly over a low fire, they provided both nutrition and comfort. Potatoes, you may be surprised to hear, were not part of the medieval menu. They had yet to arrive from the New World. Beans and lentils were another staple, rich in protein and fiber. They were dried during harvest and stored in sacks, rehydrated and cooked into thick, hearty stews that simmered for hours. Garlic and onions added depth, while herbs brought faint hints of green brightness. Preserved meats, if you had any, were rare but treasured. A family might salt and hang strips of pork or smoke sausages over the hearth. Fat was not discarded. It was rendered into lard and used in cooking, stored in clay pots sealed with cloth. In some regions, small game like rabbits or birds could be caught, though hunting rights were often reserved for the nobility. Dairy, when available, was equally valuable. Milk spoiled quickly, so it was often turned into cheese or butter, hard. Cheeses aged in cool rooms. Butter was kept in sealed crocks, sometimes salted to prolong its life. As for sweets, these were not the desserts of modern life. Honey, when available, was the main sweetener. Dried fruits such as apples, plums, or berries were rare treats, sun-dried during summer or smoked lightly to prevent spoilage. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were expensive, imported, and mostly reserved for the wealthy, though a small amount might find its way into a holiday dish if fortune allowed. One curious tradition, found especially in colder climates, was gruel or ale porridge, a thin, warm mixture of ale, grains, and sometimes herbs, drunk or eaten as a nourishing breakfast. Weak ale was often consumed more than water, not because it was intoxicating, but because it was safer to drink than potentially contaminated well water. In religious households and monastic communities, fasting seasons deeply shaped the winter menu. Advent and Lent, for instance, forbade meat, dairy, or rich foods. In response, cooks developed creative dishes using almond milk, fish, and vegetable pottages. Monks, despite their spiritual simplicity, were often among the best-fed members of society, thanks to garden cultivation, steady schedules, and donations. And then there were the feast days, which offered brief escape from the monotony. Christmas, Epiphany, and local saints' days allowed for slightly more elaborate meals. Roasted meat if it could be spared, pies if flour and fat were available, mulled wine or spiced ale for those in more privileged households. These meals were communal affairs, shared with neighbors and family, warming both body and spirit. The elite, of course, dined differently. In castles and great halls, winter meals could be grand and elaborate. Venison, roast goose, swan, and spiced wine. But even here, the limitations of the season were felt. Preserved fruits, dried peas, and salted fish stood in for fresh delicacies. The contrast was more about quantity, not variety, but whether rich or poor, highborn or humble, the winter table was always about endurance. It was about making do, stretching ingredients, using every part, turning the ordinary into the essential. There is something remarkably human in this seasonal rhythm, a shared sense of preparation, frugality and resourcefulness. Winter cuisine was not only about survival, it was a reflection of knowledge passed down. When to harvest, how to dry, what to salt, what to save. A meal in January might taste of effort from August. So as you lie here now, perhaps warm under soft covers, consider this, that comfort, like food, is often the result of what we store away. And those who came before us, despite cold and darkness, found ways to nourish themselves and one another with what little they had. In the modern world, we face winter with the flick of a switch. Heat flows from vents, light spills from bulbs, warm water appears from taps. We are wrapped in layers of insulation and electricity, barely thinking twice. But in the Middle Ages, each hour of comfort was earned through cleverness, through small and steady adaptations to the cold. Let us begin with the most essential companion, the fire. Hearth fires were the heart of every home, not just a symbol of warmth, but a literal source of life. And though we might think of them as simple flames, there was a quiet complexity to tending a medieval fire. It was never allowed to die completely. At night, embers were carefully banked under ashes, smothered just enough to keep their heat. Come morning, they were coaxed back into flame, tended as tenderly as a child. To contain these flames, households used clay or stone hearths built low to the ground. The smoke in earlier centuries curled upward and escaped through simple holes in the thatch or eaves. Chimneys, a later innovation, made a marked difference in both air quality and indoor heat. But for many rural families, open fires remained the norm for centuries. Above the fire, a pot hung from a wrought iron hook, adjustable so it could be raised or lowered depending on the dish. This was the central feature of the home. The cooking pot, where broth simmered, grains boiled, and bits of dried meat softened into stew. And when the fire needed fuel, it was the humble firewood stack that bore the burden. Gathering, chopping, stacking, it was a year-round task. Woods were chosen carefully, oak for long-burning coals, birch for quick ignition. Wet wood was avoided for it smoked and burned poorly. Even the bark had its uses, twisted into kindling, woven into baskets, sometimes boiled for its tannins. Heating, of course, was only one part of the equation. Clothing was another, and here too simplicity met ingenuity. Most garments were made of wool, a material perfectly suited for cold, damp climates. Sheep were sheared in spring, and their wool cleaned, carded, and spun throughout the warmer months. In winter, that labor paid off. Wool retained heat even when wet. It could be layered, patched, and woven tightly. For extra chill, cloaks lined with fleece or fur were precious, though rare. Head coverings were essential. A linen coif or woolen. Hood retained heat and protected the ears. Mittens, sometimes felted from scraps, allowed fingers to work while keeping the cold at bay. Feet were wrapped in scraps of cloth or thick socks, stuffed into leather shoes that were greased against moisture. Crude, yes, but effective. When dry straw was also tucked inside for insulation. For warmth in bed, sleeping arrangements were equally pragmatic. Families often shared a single bed or sleeping platform pressed close together beneath a pile of woolen blankets or fur coverings. Body heat was precious. Even the dog might be welcomed into the bed on particularly bitter nights. Sometimes a bed warmer was used. A metal pan filled with hot coals slid between blankets before sleep. It warmed the sheets, though it was never left inside for long. The risk of fire was too great. Still, the feeling of climbing into a bed already warmed was a rare and cherished luxury. In monasteries and larger manorial homes, more advanced heating systems began to appear. Tiled stoves, known later as kachelofen, could retain heat long after the fire died out. In castles, fireplaces grew more elaborate, with hoods and chimneys and benches nearby, where one might thaw frozen hands. But for most peasants, the tools remained humble and required constant maintenance. In the kitchen, preservation tools were vital. Salt barrels, drying racks, clay pots sealed with wax or lard. Cold weather aided in preservation, but it could also freeze supplies if not carefully managed. Root cellars were insulated with straw. Clay jugs were wrapped in cloth. Salted meat was hung in the eaves, where smoke from the fire kept it safe. Even transportation saw winter adaptations. Roads became icy or impassable, so sledges, flat-bottomed wooden sleds pulled by people or animals, were used to move goods. Shoes might be fitted with rough wool or straw wrappings to prevent slips. In mountainous regions, primitive snowshoes, or wide leather soles helped distribute weight over snowy paths. And when everything else failed, people relied on a final invention: rhythm. The pacing of the day, the planning of meals, the rituals of light and shadow. They followed the clock, not of gears but of nature. They rose with the faintest light, paused at midday, ended their work as darkness fell. There is something quietly profound in these tools, not just objects, but answers to the same question repeated each year. How do we survive the cold? Through fire, through wool, through sharing and pacing and patience. Not every tool was made of iron. Some were made of habit, of memory, of care.